Shalom Aleichem. Our topic tonight is Tefillin v'chol Hamoed. In Sefer Shemot, Perek Yud Gimel, we have the well-known parasha of Kadesh Lichol Bechor, which speaks about Bechoroth and goes on to speak about Pesach. After speaking about Pesach in Pesukim Daled and He and Waw and Zayin, he goes on to say in Pesuk Taif, وَهَيَا لَخَ لَأُوثْ عَلِي يَدَخَ وَلْزِكَرُونَ بَنْ عِنَاخَ لَمَعًا تِيَا تُرَاث أَدُونَي بِفِيخَ كِي بِيَدْ حَزَقَ هُسِعَخَ أَدُونَي مِنْ مِسْرَيْنِ. This Pasuk refers to the mitzvah of Tefillin, right? A sign or something to remind you of the inyan of Yetziat Mitzrayim on a daily basis. And the final pasuk of that parasha says, "V'shamarta et hachukah hazoth lemo'adah miyamim yamima." You shall keep this chukah, this law, in its appointed time, lemo'adah miyamim yamima. The question is, to what does this pasuk refer? There are those amongst the Chachamim who explain that this pasuk refers to the mitzvah of Tefillin, which was mentioned in the pasuk, in the preceding pasuk, and there are those who say that it's referring to the essential topic of that parasha, which is Pesach. And these two views appear amongst the Tanaim, and in the Talmud Bavli, for example, we find in Masechet Menachoth Taf Lamed Waw Amud Beth, we find the following Beraitha. Tethania was taught in the Beraitha as follows: "V'shamarta v'chukah hazoth lemo'adah miyamim yamima, yamim v'lo leloth." In other words, according to those who understand that this pasuk refers to Tefillin, so if it says miyamim yamima, this is seen as a source for the well-known halakha that was accepted by all the Tanaim, as far as we know, with the exception of Rabbi Akiva, that tefillin are worn during the day, but there's no mitzvah to wear tefillin at night. Miyamim yamim v'lo leloth. And then it also says miyamim. It doesn't say yamim yamim, it says miyamim yamima. And the Beraitha continues, miyamim v'lo kol yamim. The word, the mem at the beginning, is seen as a mi'ut, and therefore we understand that there are some days of the year when one does not wear tefillin. So the Beraitha states, "Miyamim v'lo kol yamim, perat l'shabbatot v'yamim tovim." Divrei Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. So the view of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili is to explain this pasuk, "V'shamarta v'chukah hazoth lemo'adah miyamim yamima," to be referring to Tefillin. And from this pasuk, or either from this pasuk, he learns or he bases the masoreth that they had, that Tefillin are not worn, A, not at night, B, not on Shabbat, C, not on Yamim Tovim. He bases it on this pasuk. Rabbi Akiva, however, disagrees. Rabbi Akiva states, "Lo ne'emar chukah zo ela lefesach bilvad." This pasuk that you referred to, Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, is not talking about Tefillin bichlal. This pasuk is referring to Korban Pesach. That this is something that one does once a year, and you have to keep it lemo'adah, which means at this proper time. As I said earlier in the parasha, in pasuk Daled, Hayom atem yosim b'chodesh ha'aviv, you are leaving Mitzrayim b'chodesh ha'aviv, and you have to make sure that you always keep this mitzvah of Pesach b'chodesh ha'aviv, which is why sometimes we add a month to the year, etc. And that's what the pasuk goes on to say, Perek Yud Gimel, pasuk He, that when you enter Eretz Yisrael, وَعَبَدْتَ et ha'avodah hazot, you shall do this act of worship, this avodah, b'chodesh hazeh, in this month. That is to say, Chodesh Aviv, the month of the spring. And the final pasuk of this parasha says, Rabbi Akiva, وَشَمَتَ تَحُكَى hazot l'mu'adha, in its proper time. Miyamim, yamima means you shall keep it at that appointed time, b'chodesh Aviv. Miyamim, yamima means once a year, because the term yamim in the Tanakh in many places means a year. And in many places you have this term miyamim yamima, and that means that something was done on an annual basis. In this case, therefore, as in many other cases, this is the general approach of Rabbi Akiva, that he was a pashtan, that he understood always the pesukim in what he saw as a more straightforward and context-oriented fashion, as opposed to other Tanaim, or certain other Tanaim, whose interpretations were less pshat-based, one would think. So Rabbi Akiva here says also, your interpretation of this pasuk, or your connecting this pasuk to this Misvah of Tefillin, is mistaken. The simple meaning of this pasuk refers to the Korban Pesach. Now, this being the case, we have to ask ourselves, therefore, how does Rabbi Akiva hold, if this is so, that this pasuk doesn't speak about Tefillin? Do we have any proof or any basis in the Pesukim, in the Torah, for when one does or does not wear Tefillin? So Rabbi Akiva says, yes, I do have such a Pasuk, because the Pasuk in this very same parasha says, Pasuk Teith, وَهَيَا لَخَ لَأُثْ عَلْ يَدَخَ وَلُزِكَرُونَ بَنْ عِنَاخَ. Rabbi Akiva therefore states, יכול יניח אדם תפילין בשבתות ובימים טובים, תמוז לומר, והיה לעוף על ידך ותוטפות בעיניך. This is also the pasuk that we have in Parashat Shema, of course. Misha Srichin Oth. In other words, those days that require a reminder, literally. So in other words, those days where it is necessary that we be reminded of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Yasa'u Shabbatot v'Yamim Tovim shehen gufan oth. However, Shabbat and Yom Tov are days that are known as an oth in and of themselves, and therefore you do not require a further oth. And Rashi quotes the pasuk that we all know in Shemoth Perek Lamed Aleph, speaking about Shabbat. It says in Perek Lamed Aleph Shemoth pasuk Yod Beth, وَأَتَى دَبِرْ أَلْ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل لَمُور أَخْ أَتْ شَبَّتُوثَي تِشْمَرُوا. Be very careful and diligent to keep the Shabbat. Ki oth hi beni u'banechem ledorotechem. It is a sign, is a reminder between myself, Hashem, and Am Yisrael. And Shabbatot are also, Yamim Tovim are also similar to Shabbat. So we see from the statement of Rabbi Akiva. Now we have to ask ourselves, in which way are Shabbat and Yom Tov similar? By the way, before I continue, I just want to also read to you the same Mahloketh that I just read now from the Sechet Menahoth in the Talmud Bavli, is also mentioned in the Talmud Yerushalmi. So we see in this Baraita, Masechet Menahoth, Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beth, in the Talmud Bavli, the Rabbi Akiva learns from the pasuk, "V'aya le'oth al yadecha," that days which are themselves considered an oath, this mitzvah of Tefillin does not apply. What is the obvious explanation? in which way are Shabbat and Yom Tov called an oath? They are days that are asur b'melacha min Torah. Right? These are days that the Torah prohibits melacha. There's a certain difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov, as we know, but essentially, melacha is asur on both these days. That is lichora, the straightforward understanding. Nevertheless, we see in the Tosafot a different explanation. It says in the Tosafot, Dibor matchil yasa'u, on the same daf, Lo mishum da'asireh ba'asiyat melacha. Not because these days are asur ba'asiyat melacha, da'afilu holosh mo'ed, d'shareh ba'asiyat melacha ika oth, b'fesach dasur b'achilat hametz, u'b'sukkot l'hal b'sukkah. Tosafot say you can understand, or one should understand perhaps, this concept not as referring to these days as being yamim which asurim b'melacha, but rather days when there's a special miswah which sets apart these days. The difference, of course, is obvious, that if we say that the reason Shabbat and Yom Tov are referred to as an oath, and that's in fact the day we find the Shabbat referred to as an oath in the Torah. In Yom Tov is by extension, but Hamoed we don't find referred to as an oath, not specifically as such. If one says that the word oath, or the days that are called oath, refers to Shabbat and Yom Tov, then does not include. If we understand this to be because of the fact that there are asur b'melacha, that does not include therefore Hamoed, which is vaday not asur b'melacha, certainly not in the same level as these other days. It's true that there are opinions, or there is a discussion, there is a machloket whether the minimal isur melacha that exists on Hamoed, whether it's min Torah or midivrehem. And Yerushalmi, it's mefurash that it's midivrehem, and that's what the Rambam and many Rishonim hold. But even according to those who say otherwise, it's clear that the definition of melacha and Yom Tov was decided by the Chachamim, and it's not something that one really needs to explain at great length. One just has to look outside on Hamoed and see that on Hamoed people do many things that they do on other days of the year, as opposed to Shabbat and Yom Tov. If we, however, say that it has to do with not with the Isur of Asiyat Malacha, but as the Tosafot suggests here, that the oath of Pesach is the fact that it's asur to eat Hametz on Pesach. You don't have to eat Matzah all of Pesach, but it's asur to eat Hametz all of Pesach, and that is an oath. That's a siman. That makes it a special day. And the fact that for 7 days you have to live in a sukkah, then that will also include Hamoed. So if that's the definition, that's how we understand the concept of oath, then that would mean that what Rabbi Akiva says regarding wearing tefillin, that Shabbatot and Yamim Tovim are exempt. We are patur from wearing tefillin these days because of the pasuk V'haya l'of al yadcha. This would include Hamoed. So we'd also have to understand from this that Hamoed also are days when you do not wear tefillin. This is a very strange perush, I must say, that which the Tosafot here suggests, for a number of reasons. First of all, as far as we know, there is no miswah to eat nasa on Shabbat or to live in a sukkah every Shabbat. So if the oath being referred to by Rabbi Akiva refers to Shabbatot and Yamim Tovim, which is what Rabbi Akiva says, Yachol yaniach adam tefillin b'Shabbatot u'Yamim Tovim, etc. Talmud Lomar, these days which are called an oath, you don't do it. If the oath of that's being referred to by Rabbi Akiva, the oath of the Yamim Tovim, and therefore, as we understand from this perush, therefore by extension also Hamoed refers to Masa and Sukkah, how does this explain Shabbat? Shabbat has no Sukkah and no Masa. Obviously, therefore, regarding Shabbat, everyone has to agree that Shabbatov are called an oath because of Isur Malacha, not for any other reason, correct? Do I sense some disagreement?
Explicitly calls it.
Where? Regarding Shabbat?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. But if we're bunching them together, Shabbat and Yom Tov, as being referred to as an oath,
where do we learn the extended Shabbat to Yom Tov?
That's a very good question. It doesn't say explicitly in the Torah. I said that's what I said earlier.
Yes, so
it can only be logically because of that facet in which Yom Tov is similar to Shabbat, which is Isur Malacha.
You say the other way around.
Which other way?
Shabbat, Chumash calls them off.
And what's Yom Tov from? In which way is it similar to Shabbat? How can you learn one from the other? Shabbat, Yom Tov, or Yamim Tovim, or let's say Pesach and Sukkot have specific misvot which apply during those days, which do not apply on Shabbat. How do you bundle it together with Shabbat? Logical, straightforward explanation, which we will see presently is stated by many sources, is that it's because of the Isur Malacha. Just as Shabbat is called an oath because of the Isur Malacha, so can one understand that Yom Tov is also called an oath because of the Isur Malacha. But if it's called an oath because of some specific mitzvah which exists on that day, such as not eating, or Isur of eating Hamoed, or the Hovah to live in a sukkah, or even as the grass suggests that the Masa is the oath, because even though there's no Hovah, so says the Gra, there's no Hovah to eat Masa except for the first night, but there is a Miswa to eat Masa every day. So in other words, there's a difference. One can distinguish, it's true. One can, with regards to certain Miswot and certain halachic definitions, one can distinguish between Hovah and Miswa. And Chazal makes such distinctions in certain areas. So one could claim, as the Gra claims, that the eating Masa, which is practically what people do for 7 days, most people do eat Masa for 7 days. That is the oath, even though maybe it's not a Hovah, but it is an oath. But again, one could say one could disagree with that, simply because even the Gra agrees you don't have to eat Masa for all 7 days. At any rate, the connection between Yom Tov and Shabbat is not comprehensible unless one says that we're talking about the Isur of Melacha on both of these days. Yes.
The offerings.
What do you mean the offerings? The Korban Musaf?
There are different offerings than on one day.
But that's also true for Rosh Chodesh. And then you wouldn't suggest, would you, that there's no Misvah or Tefillin on Rosh Chodesh? Although, as we'll see presently, there are those who have almost made such a suggestion. Go on.
We don't go, we'll wear it for Shachri, but we'll take it off.
I'm sorry?
We'll wear Tefillin for Shachris.
Which day are you speaking of now? Which day? Yes.
But then we'll take it off right before Musaf.
Why would you take it off before Musaf?
Yeah, because everybody else says. I have no clue why I do it.
Well, I'm here to tell you, amongst other things, that there's absolutely no reason on earth to take Tefillin off for Musaf and Rosh Chodesh. And this is a very strange minhag indeed, which is entirely 100% based on certain Kabbalistic speculative ruminations, which have no basis whatsoever in any source from Chazal. And as far as I know, as far as I recall, you will not find such a suggestion in the Rishonim either. It's a relatively late practice. In our minyan, we do not remove Tefillin for Musaf and Rosh Chodesh. Back to now, and on top of that, as I said, everyone agrees that you have to wear Tefillin on Rosh Chodesh, at least for Shaharith, correct? So clearly Rosh Chodesh is not a day where there is no Chovah to wear Tefillin. Everyone agrees to that. And the fact is that Korban Musaf on Rosh Chodesh, and there is such a Korban, proves that this is not the inyan of Tefillin is not connected to the Korban Musaf. This, of course, has no bearing whatsoever on the status of Chol HaMoed. Some people mistakenly see a connection, namely that if you wear Tefillin on Chol HaMoed, you are somehow denigrating Chol HaMoed, or you view Chol HaMoed as less important than it should be understood. as it should, then it should be regarded. That's not correct. Hol HaMoed is Hol HaMoed. It's these very important and special days. But we're not discussing now the status of Hol HaMoed in all its manifestations. We're discussing here the particular miswa of wearing tefillin, and on which days you need to wear tefillin, which days you do not wear tefillin. Another reason. So the first reason, to recap, the first reason that this Pirush of the Tosafot is difficult is because it's suggesting that regarding Shabbat, because Rabbi Akiva mentions them together in one breath, Shabbat and Yom Tov, he mentions them together as if it's obvious the connection between them. If you say that regarding Yamim Tovim is referring to the oath of Hames or Matzah, and on Sukkot the oath of Sukkah, by the way, it would be nice if the Tosafot would explain where we find that eating the Isur, not eating Hames, or the Miswa of eating Matzah, or the Miswa of living in a Sukkah, where these are referred to as an oath, because they're not referred to as an oath, as far as I know, not in the Torah Shebichtav, not in the Torah Shebaal Peh. But if that's the interpretation, that the oath of Yamim Tovim refers to Matzah or Hames and Sukkah, but obviously these things don't apply to Shabbat, then you have to say that regarding Shabbat it's called an oath for one reason, regarding Yamim Tovim it's recorded an oath for another reason. And that's a very unlikely perush. It doesn't appeal to my pshat understanding of the statement of Rabbi Akiva, because we're saying these two things, Shabbat and Yom Tov, in one breath. We're mentioning them together as if it's obvious the connection between them, when in fact, according to this perush, the connection is not clear at all. Why would you assume one is the same as the other if it's not for the reason of Isul Melacha? It has to be because of the fact that both are Asurim Bimelacha Min HaTorah. That's why both these days are called an oath. In fact, only the Torah only refers to Shabbat as an oath explicitly, but we, by extension, can apply the same to Yom Tov because it's similar to Shabbat.
Is there a connection with Kiddush?
What's the connection to Kiddush?
Is that for the Yom Tovim and for Shabbos, we go and say Kiddush, but for those that for Kol Moed as well as Rosh Chodesh, we don't.
So therefore,
the only exception to that would be Yom Kippur, which then it goes and says that Yom Kippur is also a Sabbath. So
what's the point you're trying to make regarding Hol HaMoed and Rosh Chodesh, where there's no Kiddush?
That's the issue, is that we end up sanctifying them with Kiddush.
But that's precisely you're approaching the matter from precisely the wrong direction. The reason you make Kiddush on Shabbat and Yom Tov is because these days are Asul B'Melacha Min HaTorah. That's why there's a Kiddush. That's the purpose of Kiddush. The purpose of Kiddush is to inform you and all around you and your family and everyone present, that today is a special day which is Asul B'Melacha Min HaTorah. That's the purpose of Kiddush. It's an announcement. And that's exactly why you have to do Havdalah, because you have to announce now that it's over. Alright? But days which are not Asul B'Melacha Min HaTorah do not require neither Kiddush nor Havdalah. You follow? I have another question, which on this Perush of the Tosafot, I imagine that someone's asked this question before, but I haven't looked everywhere to see if that's the case, and perhaps I will later, but it occurs to me there's an obvious kushya on what the Tosafot say here, a further kushya, and that is, if anything, it's a greater kushya. What about Shavuot? There's no Matzah and no Hametz on Shavuot, and there's no Sukkah on Shavuot. So does that mean, according to the Tosafot's interpretation, that we should wear Tefillin on Shavuot? I have never yet heard someone make such a suggestion. I'm sorry, what about Shmini Aseret? Or Shmini Aseret when there's no... You're right, you're quite right. When the Shmini Aseret, which is actually a Regel B'fnei Asmo, it's a separate Hag, where there is an Isul Melacha Min HaTorah, but there is no, it's called the Mikra Kodesh, and there's Isul Melacha in the Torah, but there's no Hametz or Matzah, there's no Sukkah on Shmini Aseret. So therefore, as I suggest with Shavuot, and as you very correctly add with regards to Shmini Aseret, these days, Lichora, you would have to wear Tefillin. No one has made such a suggestion to the best of my knowledge. So this Perush of the Tosafot to my mind, is very, very unlikely. What we would call in straightforward yeshivish speak, dahuk, perush dahuk mod. So what is the straightforward perush? I think it's clear that the straightforward perush is that Shabbatot and Yamim Tovim are days when you do not wear tefillin, because these days are days where there's an isur melacha min haTorah, and any day where there's an isur melacha min haTorah is you are patur min tefillin. And this, by the way, is exactly what the Rosh writes. The Rosh first, this is in Hilchot Tefillin in the Rosh, which is in Halachot Ketanot at the end of Masechet Menachot, Siman Tel Zayin. The Rosh writes, he brings the Mahloket of Rabbi Yosef Gilli and Rabbi Akiva, right? Whether Tefillin, the first of all, the first Mahloket between them is whether you wear Tefillin at night. Correct? According to Rabbi Yosef Gilli, which is the opinion of all the Tanaim, except Rabbi Akiva, there is no mitzvah to wear tefillin at night whatsoever, only during the day. Rabbi Akiva says that this pasuk that you refer to, Shamatata Hukah Azof Lemu'adam Yamim Yamima, does not refer to tefillin, it refers to Korban Pesach Bichlal. There's nothing to do with tefillin, and therefore there's no source for what you're saying, and therefore Rabbi Akiva concludes there is a mitzvah to wear tefillin at night as well. That's the first point that's the essential point of disagreement between Rabbi Akiva and the other Tanaim. Because Rabbi Yosef Gilili and all the other Tanaim agree that on Shabbat and Yom Tov you do not wear tefillin. That is a simple understanding of all the Tanaim and all the Amoraim as well. Despite that which is suggested in Masechet Eruvin and the Talmud Bavli, in one place where there is at the end of Eruvin there is a long discussion in the Talmud which tries to prove that there is a view amongst the Tanaim that holds that tefillin should be worn on Shabbat and Yom Tov. The fact of the matter is that Talmud doesn't really succeed in proving that, and this suggestion flies in the face of all the Tanaic sources that we have in the Midrashei Agadah, in the Midrashei Halacha, I mean to say, and in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and in the Talmud Bavli itself. For example, in the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, Parasha Yod Zayin, Masechta de Pischa, Parasha Yod Zayin, it says, first it says on this pasuk, this is according to Shita of Rabbi Yosef Gilili, as is presented here in the Braitha in the Talmud Bavli, in Menachot, it says in the Mechilta, V'shamatata Hukah Zoth, Hukath Tefillin ata omer, zo Hukath Tefillin. It raises the issue, what's it speaking about? And it says, Ha'inyan medaber b'tefillin, and then it goes on to say, Miyamim yamima. Why does it say that? Lefishu hu omer v'alecha la'oth, shome'ani af haliloth. You may think they have to wear it at night as well. B'mashma v'hadin nothen, etc., etc. It explains why you might think so. Then it goes on to say, Tamud lomar, Miyamim yamima, b'yamim ata nothen, you wear tefillin, v'lo baliloth. Then it goes on to say, דבר אחר, מימים ימימה, למה נאמר, לפי שהוא אומר, וילך לאוth, שומע אני אף שבתות וימים טובים, במשמע that you have to wear it always, every day of the year. It has to be an off on your arm, always. והדין נותן, and this is the reason why you might think so, it's like mezuzah, just as you have to have a mezuzah every day of the year, you have to have tefillin every day of the year. Therefore it says, יכול אף תפילין ינהגו בשבתות ובימים טובים, תלמוד לומר, מימים ימימה, יעשו שבתות וימים טובים. This is for an example in the Mechilta, the Rabbi Ishmael. The very same thing appears also in the Mechilta of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Here in the Mechilta of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Perek Yud Gimel, it says, Rabbi Eliezer is talking about this pasuk, V'shamata ha'chukah azot. It says, Rabbi Eliezer omer azot chukat ha'pesach. Rabbi Eliezer understands it to be referring, here the shittot are reversed, interestingly enough. It might be a mistake, because here it says Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says that the pasuk refers to Pesach, and Rabbi Akiva Dafka the one who says it refers to Tefillin. At any rate, the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon the Rashbi says, he goes on to say, according to what's presented here as a view of Rabbi Akiva, which is the reverse of what we just learned, that because it says miyamim, Talmud lomar miyamim prat leleloth. Yet then it goes on to say, Yachol yehu tefillin nohachot v'yamim tovim u'v'shabbatot. And you may think so because it's like a mezuzah, that tefillin and mezuzot usually go together, and as you need to have mezuzot everywhere you go, and on all days of the year, the same should apply to tefillin. The Mechilta continues and says, Talmud lomar miyamim u'lo kol yamim. There are days which are patur. Some days of the year are not all the 8, but miyamim, not all days of the year are chayav. So first, the Rosh, to return to the Rosh. Siman Tet Zayin, Ilchot Tefillin, the Rosh says, he brings the Mahloket Rabbi Yosef Galili and Rabbi Akiva, and he brings the Perush of the Tosafot, that the reason for Yamim Tovim being called an oath is because of the special miswot that apply during those days of Masa and Chames or Sukkah. And then, as we'll see in a moment, he brings very convincing proofs from Masechet Moed Katan, both in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, where it seems to state explicitly that tefillin are to be worn on Chol HaMoed, and therefore the Rosh says as follows: Hilkach, therefore, mistaber, it makes sense, lefaresh Gemara Didan dala paliga Yerushalmi unefaresh Yom Tov Dumya de Shabbatoth da'oth shelahem hi shmirat Shabbat mi'asiyat melacha. So the Rosh's maskana is that Shabbat and Yom Tov, which are mentioned by Rabbi Akiva as being days where one is not required to wear tefillin, are called off because of the isur of melacha, not like the perush that was that he originally quoted from the Tosafot, which of course also means that Chol HaMoed is not included. And because he reaches this conclusion, he immediately goes on to quote quotes a source that does suggest that tefillin are not to be worn on Chol HaMoed. He writes as follows: Uvasefer Ha'itim Shel Rab Barceloni Zal. This was an early Chacham, very, very early generations of the Rishonim in Spain. And he writes in this book called Sefer Ha'itim that we have, he writes as follows: Uva Piska LeGaon, in a Psak Halacha, or a tshuva written by a Gaon, doesn't say which Gaon. Halacha, Asur laniach tefillin b'Shabbatot v'yamim tovim. It's asur to wear tefillin on these days. Dichtiv v'shamatat ha'chukah hazov, and he bases this on the pasuk v'shamatat ha'chukah hazov, not on that of Rabbi Akiva, even though the halacha, the Talmud Bavli, is clearly like Rabbi Akiva. Therefore, it's not from this pasuk; it's from the pasuk right? And the Rosh immediately picks up on this in a moment. He goes on to say in this teshuvah, this halacha, psak halacha of this Gaon, and then he goes on to say, "Wa'asul laniach tefillin b'chol ha'moed." It is also asur to wear tefillin b'chol ha'moed. Well, that doesn't explain exactly where this comes from. And he goes on to say further, "Wasomeh or sumah, which is a person who is blind. Patur min tefillin wa sisit. He is patur from wearing sisit and tefillin. Dichtiv uritem otho prat lesuma." So it says in this psak halacha of this Gaon. The Rosh's response to this is as follows: Wa'en nir'eh li lismoch al hai piska. I don't think one should trust this quoted psak halacha from a Gaon brought by Arav Barceloni in the book Sefer Ha'itim. Why? Mishum de kaima lan halachak Rabbi Akiva mechaviro. The halacha is that when Rabbi Akiva disagrees with another Tanat halachas like Rabbi Akiva, وَإِهُ مُكَّئُ شَمَتَتَ حُكَّ هَذَوْتْ بِفَسَخ, and he understands this pasuk to be referring to Pesach, and this pasuk, this posek, or this psak halacha, I should say, of this Gaon is not following the Shita of Rabbi Akiva. وَشَبَتَوْ يَوْمْ تُوVِים nafkele min וَهَيَا לَأොth lecha la'oth, and Rabbi Akiva learns Shabbat and Yom Tov not from that pasuk, but from the other pasuk. V'chem pasak Rav Asher dalal azman tefillin hu, and we see in the Talmud that Rav Asher holds like Rabbi Akiva, so therefore that's the halacha. He's a bafra. Rabbi Yosef Gdili darish miyamim u'lo kol yamim prat leShabbatot v'yom tovim l'dideh waday chol hamoed bichlal yom tov kevan shekarui mikra kodesh. Aval Rabbi Akiva danafka le mishabbat v'yom tov miwaya lecha la'oth en ze bichlal. Here the Rosh says something interesting, which I, however, find rather strange, to be honest. That is that the Rosh suggests that if one holds like Rabbi Yosef Galili and understands the pasuk v'shamata v'chuk hazov lemu'adam yamim yamima is referring to tefillin, then in fact, just as he holds that from here we learn that Yom Tov is also is a day when one does not wear tefillin, so Chol HaMoed is also included. Why? Because it's called a Mikra Kodesh. But according to Rabbi Akiva, who learns it from Oyal Lecha La'oth, and it goes by the question of whether it's considered the day is called an oath or not, then Chol HaMoed is not Bichlal. I do not know exactly why the Rosh makes this suggestion, because as we will demonstrate either in this Shiur or the next Shiur, nowhere do we find the term Yamim Tovim or Yom Tov is nowhere do we find it used in such a way that it includes Chol HaMoed. We find myriad proofs to the opposite, that when it says Yom Tov, it means Yom Tov and not Chol HaMoed, and when it says Chol HaMoed, it says Chol Hashem Moed, or just Moed, that doesn't say Yom Tov. Whereas this suggestion of the Rosh implies that sometimes Yom Tovim also includes Chol HaMoed, which is something which is factually, as far as I know, not so. At any rate, the Rosh's maskana is that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva learns it from Hayal Lecha La'oth, and therefore this refers to, and this is because of Isul Malacha on Yom Tov, like Shabbat, and therefore Chol HaMoed is not included. And therefore, the halacha is that you do wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. He goes on also to point out that this psak of this Gaon is strange for another reason, and that is that this Gaon, quoted in Sefer Ha'itim, claims that a person who is blind is patur from tefillin, and the Rosh points out this is not true. It says that, first of all, on what is this based in this pasuk, in this psak rather, in this psak of the Gaon? It's based on the pasuk. It says, Suma patur min tefillin wa hasisif dichtiv uritem otho prat lesuma. That drasha, Uritem Otho, is from Parashat Sisif. It's referring to Sisif. What has it got to do with Tefillin? Whoever suggested that this has anything to do with Tefillin? So, the Rosh states this, Uritem Otho, Basisif Hu Dichtiv, Uyeshem. And so therefore, this whole psak of this Gaon is very, very dubious. The Rosh goes on to say, because it's known that there are different opinions on this issue. There are those who wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed without making a baracha, but the Rosh is not really comfortable or impressed with such halachic logic, and he says, I think you should wear tefillin and you should also make a baracha. So says the Rosh. And so he's quoted by the Tur in Siman Lamed Aleph as being the view of the Rosh. Before we begin bringing proofs from other sugyot in the Talmud that speak about that indicate clearly that one should wear tefillin, one must wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, let's first examine for a moment the view of the Rambam. What does the Rambam tell us about this issue? Rambam writes in Ilchot Tefillin, Perek Daled, Halacha Yod, Zaman hanachat tefillin bayom v'lo balayla. First of all, we see that he's not being, interestingly enough, this is not what we need to discuss, what we want to discuss right now. It's not our topic, but Interestingly enough, the Rambam holds, and I understand the Rif also holds the same way, that Zman Hanachat Tefillin min Torah is only during the day, not at night, not like Rabbi Akiva, not like most Rishonim at least understood the Talmud Bavli. And he says explicitly, Hukah zo hi miswaf tefillin. When the pasuk speaks about Roshamatata, Hukah zo le'mu'adha miyamim yamima, the Rambam says explicitly this refers to tefillin, so it's not Lashita of Rabbi Akiva. V'chen Shabbatot v'yamim tovim einan zman tefillin. Here he quotes the Shita of Rabbi Akiva, or that which we saw earlier, written in the name of Rabbi Akiva, Shene'emar v'aya lecha le'of. In other words, the fact that Shabbat and Yom Tov are days when you are patur from wearing tefillin is learned, according to the Rambam, from the pasuk that we mentioned before. The fact that nighttime is not a time when you wear tefillin is learned from the pasuk miyamim yamima, but not wearing tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov is learned from One could and should explain at length the understanding of the Rambam, etc., but we don't want to do that right now. So the Rambam says, "B'Shabbatot v'yamim tovim hen asman oth." The Rambam doesn't explain why, but I think it's obvious. I think it was obvious to the Rambam, and therefore he thought it was obvious to everybody else that Shabbat and Yom Tov are called an oath because of the Isul Melacha, and therefore these days go together, and therefore these days are your patur from tefillin. The Rambam does not mention anything about Hol HaMoed. Now, some people might claim, yes, but he just told you that Shabbat and Yom Tov you do not wear tefillin, and Yom Tov perhaps includes Hol HaMoed, correct? However, if one looks at the Rambam, and I have, by the way, heard such people make such a suggestion, interestingly or strangely enough, that the Rambam holds that you do not wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed. However, the Rambam says very, very clearly, Ilchot Shevitat Yom Tov, Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph. The Rambam states, Sheshet Hayamim Ha'elu, these 6 days, the ones I'm about to mention, says the Rambam, She'asaran HaKathuv Be'asiyat Melacha, that are days which are Asul B'Melacha, explicitly written in the Torah as being such days. The Rambam says, and what are those 6 days? Shehen, Rishon u'Shvi'i shel Pesach, the first and the 7th day of Pesach. Rishon u'Shmini shel Chag HaSukkot, and the first and the 8th day of Sukkot, and Shmini Aseret. U'veyom Chag HaShavuot, u've'echad l'chodesh HaShvi'i and Rosh Hashanah. Hen ha'nikre'im Yamim Tovim. These days are referred to as Yamim Tovim. What did the Rambam just tell you? Yom Kippur is a day which is Asul B'Melacha, but it's not referred to as a Yom Tov. In fact, it's more Hamur than Yomim Tovim when it comes to Melacha, as we know. It's like Shabbat, essentially. Here the Rambam states, in very straightforward terms, that the days that are referred to, when we speak in Halacha, when Chazal speak about Yomim Tovim, they refer to these 6 days of the year. The first and last day of Pesach, the first and last day of Sukkot, that's 4 days. Shavuot, which is the 5th day, and the first day of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, is the 6th day. These 6 days, in the Chutzaretz, we know there's an extra day, which is, but that's not Min HaTorah. These 6 days are referred to as Yamim Tovim. Therefore, when the Rambam tells you in Yechot Tefillin Perek Daled that you do not wear tefillin on Yom Tov, it obviously means only these 6 days. It can't mean any other day. Hol HaMoed, the Rambam speaks about it, but it's not referred to as Yom Tov. So therefore, whenever it says, clearly Vadai according to the Rambam, when the Rambam says that such and such a halacha applies to Yom Tov, it can only apply to one of these 6 days. It does not apply to Hol HaMoed. The question is, which has been debated over the centuries, although I don't recall anyone actually making this point from the Rambam. This is what I know, what I see written in the Rambam here, but it has been debated for centuries whether one can claim that where it says Yamim Tovim in Chazal, it includes Hol HaMoed, or at least sometimes it does. This statement of the Rambam is quite clear that it does not do so. It's also a fact that the Rambam did not say that regarding tefillin, that you do not wear tefillin on Hol HaMoed, even if Hazal simply said Yamim Tovim, and let's say, assume for a moment they intended to include in that statement Chol HaMoed, one would expect the Rambam to clarify this point and say explicitly, this includes Chol HaMoed, L'Rabot Cholosh HaMoed, or something like that. Just another 3 or 4 words would do the job. The Rambam doesn't say that. Based on what the Rambam here says in Yichol Shavitat Yom Tov Perek Aleph Halacha Aleph, I think it's clear why he doesn't say that, because Yom Tov does not include Chol HaMoed. It never does. That's also why we have 2 separate Masechtot in the Mishnah. One for dealing with Yamim Tovim, called Masechet Yom Tov, also known as Masechet Besar, and another Masechet dealing with Chol HaMoed, known as either Masechet Moed or Masechet Moed Katan or Masechet Mashkin, whatever. It has 3 different names, but these are 2 separate Masechtot. One deals with Yom Tov, one deals with Chol HaMoed. The 2 separate Masechtot Bichlal. They're not the same at all. They're not the same in terms of Yisur Malacha. They're not the same in terms of how many people you call to the Torah on those days, right? On Chol HaMoed, like Rosh Chodesh, you call 4 people up to the Torah. Yom Tov 5. On Yom Kippurim 6, and on Shabbat 7. Which is also an indication of the relative level of kedusha and status and chashivut of that day. On the other hand, a person might say, well, it doesn't say anywhere in the Rambam that you explicitly doesn't say you do wear tefillin or Chol HaMoed. It's true, it doesn't say such a thing. Nor does it say anywhere else. By the same token, it doesn't state anywhere, in so many words, that one has to wear tefillin on a Monday morning or on Thursday afternoon. It doesn't say such a thing, because the rule is whenever, other than those days explicitly singled out by the Chachamim as days when you are patur from tefillin, you are hayav b'tefillin. That's the rule. It's very simple. Therefore, if Chazal said you're patur from tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov, you understand, therefore, that any other day you are hayav. Now, if someone were to ask, as was suggested a moment ago, what about Yom Kippur, which is not Shabbat and not Yom Tov, according to the definitions that we just saw? The answer is that essentially Yom Kippur is like a Shabbat. It's called a Shabbat Shabbaton, and it has the same halachic status as Shabbat in every way, basically. There's no meaningful distinction between Shabbat and Yom Kippurim. So, in that Yom Kippur here fits under the rubric of Shabbat. As we know that everything is asur on Shabbat is also asur on Yom Tov. On Yom Kippurim. The only difference being that the punishment, the onesh on Yom Kippur is karet, and on Shabbat it's mikabidei shamayim. So the rule of thumb is, unless you have a specific source that tells you that you are patur from wearing tefillin on a certain day or a certain hour of a certain day, you are hayav to wear tefillin at that time. Some people, of course, at this juncture may ask, well, most people don't wear tefillin all day, and the answer to that is that's a separate shiur, if one is supposed to wear tefillin all day or as many hours of the day as possible, and if and when we have that shiur b'ezrat Hashem, we will discover that it's very clear that the mitzvah of tefillin applies all day, every day. Does that mean that if you take your tefillin off and you take 2 breaths or walk 4 paces or something, you did an isur? No, it doesn't mean that. But the mitzvah of tefillin is supposed to be all day, every day, and that's again something that we can discuss in another shiur. And the sources for that are easy to come by and very numerous. But even if one understands, let's say, as has been suggested by some, that the mitzvah of tefillin is only the chovah, at least, of wearing tefillin is only a few minutes a day. Let's just say that's the case. How do you know which days of the year you're chayav to wear tefillin? It doesn't say that on Sundays you do, and on Mondays you do, and on Tuesdays you do. It doesn't say that. It says you wear tefillin always, except when? On Shabbat and Yom Tov. So if it doesn't say Cholosh Moed, that means you do wear on Chol HaMoed. If it doesn't say Rosh Chodesh, that means you do wear on Rosh Chodesh. And now I can tell you a story. And perhaps with this we'll end for tonight, and we'll continue the subject next week. Many, many years ago, I davened on a Rosh Chodesh morning in a certain Beit Knesset not far from here. And as was mentioned here earlier, what most people do without knowing how or why they do it, and not knowing any source for it, they remove their tefillin before Musaf of Rosh Chodesh, and the daven Musaf without tefillin. Now, I didn't want to cause mahloket and stand out, etc. That's not something you do in a shul where everyone's taking tefillin off and you very demonstratively keep your tefillin on. It's obviously going to cause a mahloket. Even though, of course, one might hope that another Jew might take the position that, well, I know what I do, he does something else, that's fine, I can do what he likes. Maybe he probably has some reason, but that's not how most Jews work. Most Jews are quite certain that they know exactly what one is supposed to do, and if you're not doing what they're doing, then you're definitely wrong. If at best, you may be an Apikoros as well, but you're definitely wrong. At any rate, so I removed my tefillah shel Rosh, and the tefillah shel Yad, I just removed the strap from my hand and tucked it under my sleeve, so it was invisible. And I davened in that shul many times. There was a period where I davened there every day for years, and no one had ever noticed that I didn't remove this, because everyone's busy taking out the tefillin off and wrapping them up and putting them away. So no one noticed what I was doing, and there was always no problem. There was no problem. One time, a certain gentleman, he happened to be Sfaradi and into halakha Sfaradit according to the Mekubalim. He noticed somehow that I didn't take off my tefillah shel Yad. Actually, I'm not even sure he noticed that. What he noticed was what I did on a number of occasions, or actually every occasion. Even if I removed one of my tefillin, one of the tefillot, the tefillah shel Rosh, I would then after the end of tefillah, the end of davening, I would put it on again. I would put it on and ready in the shul, and then I would leave. And I'd walk home with talit and tefillin. And no one had a problem with that, but this particular gentleman did. Why? Because again, he was Sfaradi, and he was one of the Sfaradi of the Mekubal, the persuasion. And in certain books of that type, Sifrei Halacha based on Sfaradi Kabbalah, it says that one removes one's tefillin before Musaf of Rosh Chodesh, and then davens Musaf, of course, without tefillin, and that it's not correct to put on tefillin. I don't know if it uses the word asul, but one shouldn't put on tefillin again till Minha of Rosh Chodesh. In other words, that means during Minha of Rosh Chodesh they agree, they are modeh that you should wear tefillin again, but the rest of the day in the interim, even though normally you would wear tefillin in the interim, you shouldn't do so on Rosh Chodesh, because Rosh Chodesh is a special day, whatever, something like that. Fine. So he said this is what he came to me with. He came and said, you're not supposed to put on tefillin after Musaf, you're not supposed to put on tefillin till Minha. So I said to him, and it happened to be a Tuesday, I recall. So I said to him, tell me, what day of the week is it today? He didn't understand what I was asking him, but I said, well, just tell me anyhow, just humor me, what day of the week is it? He said, it's Tuesday. I said, did you wear tefillin this morning? He said, yes. I said, why? He said, what do you mean why? I said, well, does it say anywhere that you have to wear tefillin on Tuesdays? How did you know you have to wear tefillin today? On what basis did you know that you had to wear tefillin today? He still didn't really follow what I was getting at. So then I explained to him what I said to you now. I said, you wore tefillin today, not because it says somewhere explicitly that Tuesdays is a day when you have to wear tefillin. You wore tefillin today because it's not one of those days mentioned by the Chachamim where you do not wear tefillin. It's not Shabbat and not Yom Tov. That's why today you knew you have to wear tefillin. And that's exactly how I know I'm supposed to be wearing tefillin now on Rosh Chodesh after Musaf, and not as you suggest, because Rosh Chodesh is not a day when there's any halacha, there's any statement of the Chachamim which tells us that it's any different from any other day of the year. It's not a Shabbat and it's not a Yom Tov. So we see clearly, I said to him, therefore, that today being Rosh Chodesh is irrelevant to the question of whether you wear tefillin, just as today being Tuesday is irrelevant to wearing tefillin, and you yourself admit this because you put on tefillin this morning. He of course didn't accept what I was saying, but he did understand that there was something. He couldn't really reply to what I was saying, but he nevertheless didn't accept what I was saying. What we see here clearly is that even though one can find some fairly ancient sources, such as the the psak of this Gaon, this anonymous Gaon quoted in Sefer Ha'itim, in which it claims not to wear tefillin. Even if one can find a psak, such a source, and there is one other source I should mention in this regard, also from the period of the Gaonim, or actually that's also questionable perhaps. So as I'll quote the source in a moment. The point I wish to make is, even though one can find certain sources, even though they're not very numerous and not very convincing, one can find certain ancient sources which suggest that one should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and those who make such a claim suggest that Chol HaMoed is somehow included in the term Yamim Tovim. No one would make the claim that Rosh Chodesh is included in the term Yamim Tovim, which is why you don't hear anyone in ancient times making such a suggestion that you do not wear tefillin on Rosh Chodesh, not with regards to Musaf, or in general. You just wear tefillin on Rosh Chodesh as usual. But in certain Kabbalistic circles, just as we will learn next week, that the only real source that explicitly speaks about not wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed is to be found in the Zohar. In other words, it comes from certain Kabbalistic circles. In the same way, this idea was extended by latter-day Mekubalim, not based on the Zohar, but based on their understanding of the matter, that it should also apply to Rosh Chodesh, at least partially, so that part of the day you shouldn't wear tefillin. Which is in itself a strange concept, that any day can be divided into sections. That there's this section of the day when you do wear tefillin, there's this section of the day that you do not wear tefillin. That's rather strange. But
Tisha B'Av.
What about Tisha B'Av?
Common practice is not to wear it during Shacharis, but then to wear it during Mincha.
Common practice where? In the shul that you're familiar with, perhaps. I can take you to 1,000 shuls in Yerushalayim where people do wear tefillin today, especially since that's the position of the many of the Sfaradim. This halakha is not wearing, or this practice of not wearing tefillin on Tisha B'Av, at best is a minhag. At worst, it's a mistake, but it's definitely not a halakha of any kind. So it's not relevant to this discussion. It's not relevant to this discussion. So, do we have any other source whatsoever that, by the way, that suggests that one should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed? There's a very ancient book of halakha written approximately 1,200 years ago, called Halachot Gedoloth, written by Rabbi Shimon Kaira, who was a great chacham in Surah in Bavel. We have more than one nusach of the Halachot Gedoloth. There are two essential nuschaot of the Halachot Gedoloth. In the one version of Halachot Gedoloth, it simply states, as I have here, this version here, which is based on the first printing of the Halachot Gedoloth. This is the Hossa'ah that I'm reading from now, is the Hossa'ah, the edition of Machon Shilo, Amud Resh Samach Tech. It simply states here, Tanya Rabbi Akiva Omer, he's being quoted by Rabbi Akiva, Yachol Yaneh Hadam Tefillin B'Shabbatot V'Yom Tovim, Tamud Lomar, V'yala Oth Al Yadcha, Mi Shesarich Oth, Yasu Elo Shehen Gufan Oth. That's all it says. It doesn't say a word about Chol HaMoed. So again, we would understand, we would ask ourselves, does the term Yom Tov include Chol HaMoed, yes or no? And if the answer is no, then obviously there's no source in the Halachot Gedolot that you don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. In which case, as I just explained, if there's no source that you don't, then that means you do. In another version of Halachot Gedolot, which is this is the Hossa'at Mikis Damim edition, the first volume, page 482, it quotes exactly the same statement that we just read now. In other words, after stating that one does not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov, it goes on to say, "U'she'ilu mikame ma Rav Yaakov ben Haviv." Who is Rav Yaakov ben Haviv? No one knows. He's not known or mentioned anywhere else but in this line in the Halachot Gedoloth. It's entirely unclear who he was. Certainly not known as a great authority. In this version of the Halachot Gedoloth, it says this question was asked of Rav Yaakov ben Haviv, Le'inyan tefillin. وأمر أسول أنيach tefillin b'chol shel moed, and he said it's asur to wear tefillin b'chol moed. Uba'esh she'ila, in other words, it was asked, why is this? He'ach asur aniyach, where does it say it's asur? My ta'ama as-sa'o ka-Shabbat Yom Tov. The answer was given that it's like Shabbat and Yom Tov. Now this statement comes on the heels of the statement, as I said before, where the halachot gedolot, by the way, works just like the Rif works, or rather one could say the other way around. The Rif works like the halachot gedolot. How does it tell you what the halacha is? It quotes sections, pieces from the Talmud, those relevant statements in the Talmud which are halacha pesuka, without all the pilpul and without the agadah, of course, just giving you the essential halachic statements, and by bringing that which is halacha, you know this is the halacha. What it leaves out, it's not halacha. It's exactly the same logic as we said before, where it tells you don't wear tefillin, you know that you don't. Everywhere else you know that you do. Here also, halachot gedolot, and later the Rif wrote his sefer halacha, Chot Rif, based on the same methodology, that you quote that which is halacha, and that which you do not mention is apparently not halacha. So after quoting Rabbi Akiva, as quoted in the Braita, it says Tanya, it's written in the Braita that Rabbi Akiva says you do not wear tefillin on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Then regarding Chol HaMoed, it says that it was asked of this basically anonymous Chacham, Rabbi Yaakov ben Haviv, what about Chol HaMoed? And he said, no, you do not wear Chol HaMoed. The very fact that this statement in this version of the Halachot Gedolot, when dealing with Chol HaMoed, has to refer to a single individual Chacham who's not actually very well known at all, as the source for not wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed, that itself proves that there's no source in Chazal that suggests that you don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. If there was such a source, why would he have to go out on such a limb and find a statement by one specific Chacham who's actually not very well known at all and not mentioned anywhere else, in order to demonstrate that you do not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed? Because there is no other statement anywhere that suggests such a thing, and he knows that. Whoever wrote this statement, when I say whoever wrote, I mean to say that the Halachot Gedolot was obviously, there were additions and all kinds of things were added into the text of it over the many centuries. It's a very ancient book, as I said. So sometimes you don't know if it's the original text or it's something that was interpolated later. But one way or the other, someone wrote this statement in the name of this particular Chacham regarding Chol HaMoed. That itself proves that there's no source in Chazal for such a concept. And if the claim is that Chol HaMoed is included in the term Yom Tov, well, then we have to examine the question, as I said before, which we'll do more in greater detail next time, whether the term Yom Tov ever includes Chol HaMoed, and we will see that it does not. Today we read just the Rambam, who tells us that Yamim Tovim refers to very specific days. So just based on the sources that we've quoted tonight, I think it's already should become clear that at the very least an objective person would have to admit that there is a very powerful case, and I'm understating the matter, I believe. There's a very powerful case that one must wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Next week we will see both some sources in Chazal that indicate, maybe even state explicitly, really, that one must wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And if that's the case, you must ask yourself, if it's mufurash in Chazal that you do, then how can anyone suggest that you don't? So we'll see the suggestion. The suggestion comes from the Zohar Hadash, and there in the Zohar it says that one should not wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And we will see that the entire practice of not wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed, which is here in Israel anyhow, is the practice of basically everybody. In Chutz La'aretz, you have Jews who do and Jews who do not. Basically, those who daven Nusach Ashkenaz, many of them do, not all. And those who and the Sfaradim that you have in Chutz La'aretz and the Hasidim who daven Nusach Sfarad and what have you do not. We will see next week that the practice of not wearing tefillin during Chol HaMoed is entirely based on the Zohar, is entirely based on Kabbalistic sources, and is not in any way based on any source from the time of Chazal, not based on anything that one can find in the Mishnah or the Tosefta or the Talmud Bavli or Talmud Yerushalmi. And we'll look at that next week, B'ezrat Hashem, and we'll stop here for today.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.